All right. I am so excited, Tarfia, to have you on the Dil Ki Recipes podcast. And it's
Thanks so
so
much for
good to
having
see
me.
you.
It's
Of
good to see you
course.
too.
So, Tarfia, today we're going to be talking about this whole dynamic of the bicultural identity for so many people who are from our part of the world, from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and how it can be beautiful because we get to choose and pick from the best of both. And then there can be challenges that come with it because we want to honor both parts of those world because that's a part of us because we become like this byproduct of a third culture. I want to introduce you to our listeners, our viewers. Tarfia, you have authored two poetry collections, written beautifully. You are the recipient of a Fulbright fellowship. You have three Pushcart prizes. You've been featured on periodicals, magazines, and anthologies, both here and abroad, as an accomplished writer. You've presented so many places. You're such a source of pride for us. You are also faculty and you teach. And then, of course, my favorite, that you were recognized by Harvard Law School as one of the 50 women inspiring change. And I think that so embodies the wonderful person on my podcast today.
Oh,
So, welcome.
thank you. Thank you so much. It's so good to see you and to be here with you today.
Absolutely. It's such a pleasure. Welcome to Dil Ki Recipes on your favorite social media platform. Hi, I'm Dr. Shiza Mohsin, executive coach, relationship expert, and your coach in this virtual space to support you and your Desi family in America. If you identify as being a person of color, a minority, and having some form of bicultural identity, a major goal of putting this information out is to help you realize you're not alone in this journey. If you identify as a Desi with cultural roots in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and surrounding areas, trying to meet your life and relationship needs and desires while embracing some beautiful elements of your cultural heritage, Dil Ki Recipes is for you. If you don't identify as a Desi, but have a warm, loving, human being kind of disposition and you want to better yourself, I think you'll find some good stuff in here as well. So let's go on with the show. Tarfia, I would love for you to start us off with this whole expectation and this bicultural identity and where you see, because you feel for such a larger society and writers can sense things. I feel like you're pseudo therapists of societies at large because you can sense things way better and earlier than the rest of us do. It's the beauty in art. So do share your perspective on this whole concept of bicultural identity and how you see people in the West impacted by it, both in a positive way and some of the challenges.
Yeah. Well, I think when I was younger, I definitely felt more divided. I grew up in Texas. I was born in New York, and then we moved to West Texas when I was very young. And so I grew up in a small kind of typical football town, and we were in the first wave of Bangladeshis to be in that part of the world. My father was one of four founders of the first mosque in Midland, Texas, for example. I grew up going both to an Episcopalian private school. There were expectations to be one kind of way, and then I would go home to a Bangladeshi Muslim household where I felt like there were expectations to be another kind of way. So I think for a lot of life, I felt like I was kind of going back and forth between places that seemed very different from each other. But in the last several years, I've been working on what I call integration. So it doesn't feel so much like it's one or the other, but both at the same time. And then ideally, integration means that I'm no longer choosing one or the other or ranking one higher than the other. I'm actually trying to accept this as a kind of abundance of resources, an abundance of perspectives. Like an octopus, which has eight brains, I have at least eight, probably more. So lately, I've been trying to see it as a gift of a larger perspective, but I definitely struggled with what it means to be bicultural, even in something like as simple as, I guess you could call it code switching, kind of learning one syntax to speak with the aunties, another syntax, and say when I was doing interviews, for example, with places like Princeton, I think both of those contexts have taught me that there are definitely sort of expected ways of being that sometimes I feel like I can live up to, and sometimes I feel exhausted by. So those are a few initial thoughts. I could probably talk about this topic forever. So I will just stop myself now before I start spiraling.
I want to really ask you something as a follow-up. As you were talking, I was thinking, man, because when I've talked to youth groups and when I talk to Desi teenagers, what you've described is going to resonate with so many young adults who oscillate between that, right? They go to public school or private school, and it's a completely different culture. And it's the code switch happens at 3 p.m. or 4 p.m. when they come home and they come to a Muslim or an Indian or a Bangladeshi, whatever cultural home where there is a decorum. And then, of course, like the weekends, right? For these kids, especially the preteens and the teens, when they cannot drive, they're going to these auntie dinners and, they're trying to make sense. And what I hear from so many of them, because I was not born and raised here, that it's so difficult to gauge who you can talk to because all of us have an American, a Western accent. We sound the same, but the homes we come in, the truths in our homes are so different sometimes. But yet we come together to socialize, and there's some rekindling of that home culture. But it's like almost stressful for some kids and very easy for some. So I was wondering, like, when do you remember the voice changing to really noticing yourself versus these worlds that you're constantly trying to fit in?
I feel like it's less one moment and more just a bunch of moments over and over again, you know? So sometimes, I mean, I think that the game of life is trying to figure out how to be a human being on your terms, but still kind of figure out how to move in the circles you want to move in. And sometimes those circles are not necessarily ones you want to move in, but you sort of have to figure it out. I definitely think that, we're talking about kind of the code switching between our diaspora spaces and say our professional spaces, which requires us to code switch not necessarily even just culturally, but also between industry sectors. For example, if you're in tech, you speak one kind of language. If you're in the arts, like I am, or in academia, you speak a different kind of language. And I think that maybe that is just what is the expectation of everybody now, any human being now in a global sense. But I think that unique to some of the ways in which where diaspora spaces work is that there's this attempt to try to preserve kind of like the old home culture, some of which is quite beautiful, right? Like we have a great hospitality and great food culture. We also have beautiful fabrics and textiles and things like this, things that are just really beautiful and easy to appreciate, but maybe seem out of place kind of in the more Western sphere where we might get comments on our choices. And so I think some of us maybe find it easier to fly under the radar and just when in Rome, do as the Romans do versus trying to assert some version of an authentic self. But at the same time, I think that that pressure can be really tiring, to kind of be in those spaces fluidly. I think I'm in my 40s now, and I think I'm like a dinosaur of my particular generation, like I'm maybe the oldest, one of the oldest versions of kids who were born and raised in the States. And I was just talking to a niece who was in high school and she's facing some of the same issues I faced. And I'm thinking, when does it get to change? I thought we were gonna move on from some of these kind of just angsty reactions that we have where we feel misunderstood or we feel unseen in either one of the spaces, whether it's Western spaces or our South Asian diaspora spaces. I don't know the answers. I just started rambling at some point, Shiza. I
I
hope whoever's
love
listening is
it.
going to be editing,
I'll tell
but I'm
you,
just
Tarfia,
rambling.
I think that listeners need to hear this dialogue, this conversation, because there's so much relatability, right? This is not therapy. This is just basically a same space. And this is an exchange. So everyone listening knows that they're not alone. And you said something really powerful, which I noticed, and I'm wondering what you see, is that there is such a huge difference for families or kids, like you said, you and or a cousin, into how acculturated or integrated their parents are, because that changes the interaction. And so you see that where the parents are a lot more understanding or they've been exposed to the culture a lot more, are less, pure culture, it's easier for those kids. And then those kids have to coexist with the kids who are struggling with parents who may not understand, like simple things from school, whether it's homecoming or prom or getting permissions to go or opposite gender socialization. All of those things either become issues or not, also depending on, the parents' open-mindedness.
Yeah, and there's no one single experience. I mean, I know in the Bangladeshi community, I had a friend whose parents were not sort of the typical high expectations, who were actually pretty chill and pretty flexible and were not verbally abusive, but he reported feeling left out and commiserating with some of his other friends because the bigger story was that kind of more stereotypical story of not being misunderstood. And so I was thinking, stories like that get swallowed up in kind of the larger, sadder, you could call them more kind of spicy, savory stories where there's like violence and there's abuse and there's, angst and things like that. And then at the same time, I'm just thinking about a family that we know where the parents are what I think of as extremely Bangladeshi. Culturally, they're always having really lovely parties and that are distinctly Bangladeshi and kind of that preservation of certain traditions and cultures, but they named their sons Kevin and Brian. So there, there's just, I think there are so many different kinds of stories. One thing that I hear young women specifically reporting is fatigue with aunties' focus on, say, weight loss, for example, or body image,
Mm.
or, not just size or shape, but also fairness of skin color or hair type. The youth all are still kind of reporting heavy-handedness from the older generation. And I've spoken to that generation and I've heard them tell stories about the same thing happens to them. So I think people have to want to change. It's tough to know where these lines are, especially because if you go back to Bangladesh or Pakistan, those societies have actually evolved. And in some cases, what you find in diaspora is more conservative than it is back home. So everything just feels sort of topsy-turvy in that regard. And one thing that I would love to see for all of us is just more of our stories out there, period, more of the range of our stories, because I think we feel like we are all flattened in this country. There's like the umbrella of South Asian solidarity, and of course, like our unique histories are actually quite complicated, like India has beef with Pakistan, for example. Like it's
Oh
not,
my
do
goodness,
you know
yes.
what I mean? Like, and even my husband is a big cricket fan, and so he was watching the India-Pakistan match recently, and
Oh goodness.
exactly. So there's just I keep finding bigger and more complex questions like how do we sort of encourage us as a community to sort of evolve and maintain flexible without necessarily giving away too much ground of the things we value. It's a tough call. It seems like an impossible task, but I think that conversations like this show that people are open to thinking more deeply and maybe I don't know what I think about change exactly, but maybe trying to evolve.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting. India, Pakistan is like such a thing. And now even the Westerners are very aware that, oh, there's a conflict. Did you know? I didn't know. And it's adorable. And my response typically is that, yes, politically there's a conflict. But when you look at Indians and Pakistanis, we get drawn to each other so easily because there's so much cultural common ground and there's so much love. And the only time we beef is with cricket, because that's when the loyalty and, right now my heart is aching because the Pakistan team is not doing really well, is what I'll say. But to your point that you said a lot of times what I notice in my practice as I work with people is that the cultural moray or the cultural belief kind of gets locked into the year of migration. So if somebody left Bangladesh or Pakistan or India in the 70s, well, that's where the values are stuck. It's blind loyalties. The iPhone has gone up and upgraded, but they haven't checked in. And so when they then go with their children, giving them the stories of what these countries were like, and their children are like, nobody's like that. You're just trying to portray all of this to us. But when we go there, they're a lot more advanced, a lot more evolved than the families that are now just trying to preserve the bubble that they created to feel safe.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
that young kid period, the teenager period that we go through. The second thing I want to transition to is the career choices. So South Asians are notoriously known in terms of when we're trying to balance, the will, the interest, the motivation. And you're a writer, which is not a traditional career. We have like our cookie cutter careers that we like to push our children in as a community. I'm wondering how you see it.
That's a really big question. One thing I'm thinking about is how that expectation, that cookie cutter expectation of a doctor, lawyer, engineer developed in the first place, which is, I suspect at least, and you were also saying it depends so much on the year of migration that was happening. So for my father, for example, he came after the Immigration Act of 1965 was passed. And that act made it possible for a lot of our professionals to come over and establish a life here. I think that's really interesting. And the Immigration Act of 1965 also happened to occur on the heels of the Civil Rights Movement in America. So a lot of the rights that we have as South Asians actually comes from a lot of the kind of sacrifices Black people made in the United States. And then earlier migrations, whether it's the Chinese in the 1800s, for example, or even there was actually a wave of Bengali migrants who came in the late 1800s and established themselves in places like Harlem, for example, and New Orleans, married into the communities. And so there's actually a number of migrations. And to your point, where and when you show up also dictates how you kind of move forward. So for my father, he came over as a doctor. He came with a wave of other folks from South Asia at the same time who had the same expectations of becoming a doctor or something else professional. My personal theory is that expectation means that there's a kind of fear in that generation that if the kids aren't professionalized, that they will be sent back home, whatever that might mean, right? I just think it's interesting to understand maybe why there's this kind of expectation that we be professional in the first place. And it doesn't really come from us. It actually comes from a bureaucratic system that we have to kind of negotiate with in the first place. So that's something that I'm thinking about that's been on my mind. My choice as somebody who is also born and raised in a country where there is this notion of free will or agency or sort of the American dream kind of struggles with balancing between, say, this kind of like older generation's fear that we might be asked to leave. And so we should do things that kind of maintain that professional facade, and also balancing that against I can be whatever I want to be. So the result of that, I guess, is that I have become a writer because that feels to me like the most professional version of what I actually see myself as, which is an artist. But you can't just go around telling people you're an artist. You have to actually figure out your hustle and then prove yourself as an artist, and then you can say you're an artist. For me, there was definitely years in which my family was like, you have lost your mind. And specifically, my first two books are poetry books. So just imagine I'm telling my parents, not only do I want to be a writer, but I want to be a poet. And they're thinking, you are not going to be able to make a living at all. We're going to have to support you for forever. So of course they got upset. And at the time, I felt like it was very unfair. It definitely felt like what I called World War III for a while. But I really think that their intention is to protect me and to make sure I have what they think of as a good life, which means some level of fiscal responsibility. An artist and fiscal responsibility don't seem like they would be in the same sentence. But I was really defiant, for better or for worse. I still am. I have a rebellious streak in me, and I think a lot of us do actually, but for better or for worse, I actually don't know how I was able to keep that rebellion alive, but I have. And now I'm in the profession as a faculty member, a teacher, where I encourage other people to nurse and to connect with that rebellious streak. I'm very invested in my students learning to think for themselves and having their own imagination. And I think that's so important for our youth, especially because we have so many expectations put on us. To go back to this expectation of becoming a professional, it's quite ironic because we all come from countries that are also quite celebrated for their artistic output. I think there's a lot of confusion in diaspora kids, especially about how to listen to that artistic nature, which does feel like it belongs to all of us, and still maintain that kind of professional status that gives us that security of living in a country that maybe where we're not quite sure whether we are wanted or not. And we're in a huge moment of conversation around what it means to be an immigrant in the first place. I think that the challenge of being both a professional and an artist, there is a path forward to do that. There is a way to make it possible. And even if those of us who have artistic leanings don't end up become professional artists, like I still think that it's worth it to encourage each other and ourselves in listening to that part of us that wants to make art and wants to be artists, because that's also where our souls live. That's also a spiritual practice as well. And I'll just stop there.
That's just so profound, Tarfia. And I'll tell you, one of the secret motivations of having you on this podcast was that, we have lots of examples maybe on the forefront for these traditional careers. And whenever I talk to kiddos and young adults who are these aspiring artists, for them to hear that this is a person we can relate to. This is a person that is not going through that cookie cutter career trajectory that has been pushed to us. I've been called all sorts of things when I was pursuing my PhD, including, well, if you had to study so much, why didn't you become a real doctor? And
Oh,
so,
God.
it's like those comments definitely come out of our culture in so many ways. But to your point, it's that fear of survival that they want to make sure that we have a means to pay our bills, a means to be able to sustain ourselves in the arts. I really feel that it's the brave ones, because it's so not the road that is more traveled by. So it's wonderful to see people like you. I went to see a play this past weekend, Life of Pi. And it was just so beautiful to see. The main character was an Indian kid and he did a brilliant job. And I was like, oh my goodness, like in the olden days, as I'm becoming an old lady, it's like that was not something that was common. And so now that career option is there. You see a lot more kids in the non-traditional Desi professions outside of medicine or banking or engineering, all of those. We have writers and actors and musicians that are coming out. I'm very hopeful that has produced some form of better balance in that space, for sure. Because you hear that beta, be practical. It's tough for these kiddos and young adults as they're making those career choices. I love this, by the way. I love your perspective. I want to talk about the next chapter of people's lives. So from teenage to career, and now the marriage and partnership time. And, this bicultural identity and the process and journey of finding your person, whether it's arranged, whether it's introduced, whether it's love marriage, whether it's an interfaith thing. There are lots of dynamics that get explored in the space for so many Desis. And now with the divorce rate being so high, we have an equal number of people trying to find love the next time and, the second or third or fourth time, as divorce is becoming a lot more common. So people are, for those marriages that were struggling, people are now finding those opportunities to find love again. The young adults now have this opportunity to have more say or input on the most part. I was wondering, as a writer, what do you see changing in society as it comes to this area, from transparency to secrecy to dating or not, and what kind of dating, in the Muslim culture, halal dating or not? And I see all kinds of things in my office. As a person who reflects as they notice society, what are you noticing?
I'm thinking about two things. I'm thinking about sort of our modern moment and how many even apps there are where you can kind of connect with people worldwide now, and how my parents also at the same time have this very sweet story of arranged marriage. I just learned it for the first time ever. They've been holding out on us this whole time, this really adorable story of how they met for the first time, where they didn't know each other very well. They saw each other basically in a Chinese restaurant, and they happened to be wearing the same color. Ma was wearing the same color sari of the shirt that my father was wearing, and apparently the shirt and the sari are still folded together. However, they've been married for about as long as I've been alive. So that's a long time for these two pieces of, I know, these two pieces of fabric to be together, and how for our parents, they didn't necessarily have choices. And those marriages have somehow, for the most part, stayed together. I think that generation, for better or for worse, a lot of those marriages are still intact, whereas our younger generations have more of the reputation, I think, for divorce than our parents' generations do. I don't know what to make of that, except that this is maybe the pitfall of having a lot of different choices. And that's sort of one thing that has changed with our modern moment. And at the same time, I think it's wonderful for us to have as many choices as we have. And our parents had to have one sort of story, and we have to have a different story, just based on where we are in space and time as a society and as communities. And yet at the same time, like, I think that again, it goes back to how many different stories we allow ourselves to be a part of and how many different stories we allow ourselves to tell. I want for us so many more stories than we give ourselves permission to be a part of, our community. And I think there's room for many different kinds of love stories. Though I think for me, just personally speaking, I dated both inside and outside of the community, inside and outside of the faith, inside and outside the culture. And I learned a lot doing that. I met a lot of interesting kinds of people. When you're born and raised in diaspora, you are aware of these different options in your life, even if you choose not to explore them. I'm somebody who wanted to explore, and I know other stories of folks who are down for the arranged marriage experience and it's going well for them. So who's to say what's better or what's not? I think to go back to a question that you asked that I didn't really answer about being a woman, I do think that we're still kind of fighting with gender norms and gender expectations in our communities. One thing that came up when my husband and I first started talking is I told him in no uncertain terms that I wear exactly what I want. But that's not something that I would say to a non-Muslim, non-Desi person
Mm.
necessarily. But because he was, a Muslim Desi person, I felt like I was already sort of defending myself against what I expected him to
Disclaimer.
sort of be. Yeah, exactly. I was sort of like, PSA, I wear what I want as a woman in this life. And whether I want to be modest or I want to be immodest, that's no one's business but my own. Things like that are still alive and well in the community as these sorts of negotiations. I'm curious about how you feel about this topic as well.
It's so interesting as I see our society evolve because I'm seeing growth and I'm also seeing stuckness. It's the unfortunate side effect for my kind of work. I will tell you that one of the differences that I think was between the parents' generation and our generations is that loyalty was a big thing. And because there wasn't the choices, people stayed in their marriages. I've seen a big increase as well because I predominantly work with couples. I do premarital counseling. And what I've noticed, and I used to say in a funny way, when people would say, well, our culture has such a lower divorce rate compared to the Western culture. And my response would be like, yes, absolutely. But our miserable marriage rate is also very high because everybody, they hate each other, they won't leave each
Yeah,
other, they fight every
yeah,
day, and then they go for dinner, and then they're also taking care of each other's medicines. And you see the grumpy couple that will not leave each other's side. So it's like,
yeah.
can't live with you, can't live without you is that formula. Now as we are growing, I definitely see the angst, especially in the dating culture. I notice that there's too much choice, which gets people into analysis paralysis. And there is also this level of, well, can I get better? It's almost like a shopping cart. And what a lot of times people don't realize is that committed relationships and beautiful relationships, in my view, are not about finding that perfect like thing on Amazon. It's about building it, right? You fall in love with somebody who wants to know you, who admires you, who adores you, it shows generosity, understands, who sees you. And you have to make an effort in that. So that's really not something that you place an order for. So a lot of times the resumes match and the families get busy with the wedding. There is less focus on true connection, compatibility, emotional maturity match, and so forth. And I don't know if that makes sense, but I
Yeah,
feel like there's a
absolutely.
big gap in that space.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I agree with you that there's a kind of addiction to upgrading. And some of that seems maybe one arena that is the most affected by capitalism is that particular sector. Although maybe we wouldn't see it that way because we still want to believe that we're thinking about concepts like love and connection. I, up until really recently, was really cynical in this department. I mean, I matched with my husband on a Muslim dating app, a Muslim marriage app that I really only had on my phone to get my mother off my back for when she was going to ask me if I was
I love
trying or
it.
not. And so the irony is that I actually did match with someone who I get along with really well. That's happening at a later stage in life. I'm in my 40s and he's in his 40s too. So we've both been divorced before and we've gone through different rebuilds, multiple rebuilds in our life. And I agree with you that it's about building, not necessarily about having your expectations met right away or kind of like having some checklist, a never-ending checklist of what you're sort of expecting in that department. It's tough too because we're also all kind of married to our professions in a way too. And finding someone you can just coexist with who is sort of supportive supportive of your goals and not necessarily threatened by them or has their own goals. It's not easy in this world where I think everybody is sort of trying to level up all the time. I don't know, I'm trying to be more accepting of what reality is, and maybe what reality is this kind of in between mushy, murky space.
Yes, and I love that you said love story because Tarfia, not love stories cannot always be Bollywood all the time.
Oh, thank
You have
God.
moments, right? You have
Yeah.
moments, and actually, I'm doing another podcast with someone on the reality of marriage versus this image a lot of the youth has of what it should be like just based on what their Instagram feed and their TikTok is telling them, which is why, I started this. My clients actually pushed me to get on social media because they would send me these reels and TikToks and be like, Shizad, is that true? And I'm like, no, that is rubbish. And they're like, well, why don't you go and say something? And so this is what spiraled all of this. You said about how we are married to our careers, the gender issue now, which is very interesting because I was in a social gathering. We were just having a dialogue about women and men, especially in the second round, and who they choose. And what was interesting was age came up, careers came up, especially for women, because now there's so many women who are financially very successful. They are very judged for choosing someone who may not be at their professional level. And I was just introducing a new thought and saying that, before when men would marry somebody who may be very pretty, but no career, no education, just a simple, nice, sweet person that they just wanted to share their life with and all that they've worked hard with. There was no judgment. The example came up was that this person was a server, that this very successful woman was willing to travel for and go see. And my response was, what is wrong with that? Because finances is not, there's no economic dependence needed. But this woman may be looking for somebody who treats her well. When that wasn't an issue for the men, how is this becoming an issue for the women? So there are those gender expectations where if a man would go with somebody who is 15, 20 years younger, there would not be an issue. But if a woman does that, there's difference. So the gendered challenges are also showing up. And we're growing as a community as well.
I know so many more stories now like this where the woman is the one who is married to the profession and then the husband, just exactly what you described. And again, I think that maybe as a community we are struggling to accept change, even though change is the norm.
Already here.
And so again, I think acceptance and flexibility would be useful tools in our community, but it often feels like those two things are very much in short supply. And I can kind of understand it in the sense of change being hard for a lot of people. Accepting transformation requires adaptability that maybe we don't have naturally as a species. And at the same time, we just have to kind of face facts, which is things are how they are, and what comes around goes around. I don't know. I mean, I don't really have it. I just agree with everything you're saying, really. I've been alive at least 40 years in terms of like what my mind can remember. And I don't think I can ever remember a time where this gender disparity wasn't true in one way or another. And so I don't know. I guess I have wishes that for us that we can just adapt better and then show ourselves grace and show each other grace. I also sometimes feel concerned about this kind of division where there's so much say, oh, men, eye roll, or women, eye roll. That's not very productive either. In an ideal sense, we're all people and we have to get to know each other to build with each other. And there's nothing you can do about that, whether you're a man or a woman. But it is really, really hard to deprogram so much of that thinking, which is
Absolutely.
why you matter, which is why the work you do is important. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
appreciate that. I'll wrap up. I wish we could talk forever. This whole idea, like you said, that, we're trying to stay true to the value, but a lot of times, especially when it comes to familial respect or parental respect, it's a very fine line between respect and compliance. That boundary setting to say, I'm an adult. And I see a lot of single adult men and women struggle with what the parents wish they should do versus their own gut feeling guiding them to do things a certain way, which could be different. And I notice that because, we as a culture are very respectful of our adults and our parents and our uncles and aunties, and we take the family along with us and get a lot of benefit from that association. But in your world, as you notice families, because I definitely see that that's some of the work people come and do with me, is how do you set an adult boundary at home? How do you communicate respectfully the non-negotiables for you? What do you notice as a writer? What do you notice? And then with that, I would love for you to just share your thoughts on just the stigma around counseling and mental health and the benefit you may see for it and
Yeah.
the work people do.
Well, I've been in therapy pretty much since I was 18 years old. So that's a good 20 plus years of being in therapy. And I really think that it's very helpful to have spaces in which you can free yourself from the expectations to be perfect or to be right. And I think that our families put so much pressure on themselves and then therefore on each other to be perfect and to be right. And there's no way, that's impossible. There's no way we're ever going to get there. I just have wishes for our community. One of my wishes is that we allow ourselves to actually take part and make use of these resources. Like I think psychology and the practice of therapy is seen as Western. So maybe there's kind of this like that goes back to loyalty, as you're saying, an allegiance to a reliance on a higher power, which of course helps, but helps alongside other resources being used as well. But I also think that maybe that is perceived as a privilege. And I think there are ways in which some of us in our community feel like that is an indulgence. Maybe what I would wish also for us is to be able to have more accessible mental health care for everybody in the community and for the stigma to be removed because everybody needs somebody to listen to them without judgment. There's so much unprocessed trauma, especially in our elders. Understandable, they've had to witness a war. They had to break a lot of barriers in their own right, which is how they ended up coming here. I think going back to what you said, I so agree with you. You said that you see a lot of growth and you also see a lot of stuckness. And
I so appreciate you asking that because I definitely see both, but I'm a hopeless optimist. So, Tarfia, it's so beautiful when people who work with me drag their parents into therapy. So many times I have seen parents and they are like, well, he forced me and she convinced me to come. And you can see them falling apart and crying because they have never experienced judgment-free space where they
yeah.
are seen, where nobody's fighting with them, nobody's arguing with them. Their experience is honored and cherished. You know, the stigma comes from that whole secrecy thing. You hear that, oh, why would an outsider be somebody who would know our family business? Then there's also, I notice a lot of times the stigma around, well, if they look like us, then they must be gossiping. They could be a mental health professional, but they will go tell this one. There's that whole privacy shame thing if you're struggling, because to your point, there is the perfectionist culture. But the number of older adults in my practice is slowly and steadily increasing. So
I
I'm
love
very
that.
hopeful. I feel the younger generation, you know, they are the leaders of tomorrow. So we have to follow them. And I feel they're the ones, because when you see Gen Zs and when you see millennials, they are just so proactive and so pro therapy. They talk about a therapist just the way they talk about their personal trainer and their physician. So it's very, very exciting for me to see that people are noticing mental health as the mind to be an important organ to protect, preserve, to nourish, to heal. So I'm very excited. And I'm also hoping that there's relief because so many in our community suffer in isolation. They will not go for therapy. There's so much shame. They don't know how to even utilize the space. My wish is that as they listen to these podcasts and they listen to these elements of information, that it brings them a little bit of temporary relief.
I think relief is such a beautiful and important goal to strive for. A lot of the diaspora in general, I think we forget that we need relief and that we deserve serenity. I think that we are often trained to just go, 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 and achieve as much as we can and be a good example as best as we can. And of course, we're human and we need those times where we power down and where we are held and given emotional care and nourishment.
So I'm going to ask you one last question and then we have to wrap up. Somebody who is listening and is struggling alone and isolated, what are a couple of things you as a writer, you as somebody who's lived a very full life, would like to say to them?
It's important to give yourself value and to give your feelings and your true feelings and true thoughts their space and their worth. One thing I see in our culture just broadly is numbing instead of giving ourselves permission to feel uncomfortable feelings. So I would say trying to get comfortable with the discomfort is part of it. And I think art and the therapy that art provides can do that. And I also think, though, that connection is so important. I always think about the fact that the opposite of addiction is connection. It's not abstinence. And so I think connection is really important. The desire to self-isolate and make art is actually a desire to connect. They come from the same place. Finding spaces in which people share your passions and people share your interests, giving yourself that permission to go to a poetry slam when you're pre-med anyway. We all deserve a range of different kinds of nourishment. And I think art is a big one. So I would say to keep doing what you're doing, and you're not alone, and find spaces in which you don't feel alone.
I love it, Tarfia. Thank you so much for spending time on Dil Ki Recipes. And hopefully, in a few months or so, we'll talk about something interesting, useful. And I know that everyone listening has thoroughly enjoyed your presence. And I so appreciate you for making time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Please remember to keep listening and watching as part of your weekly self-care and learning ritual. You know there are lots of commonalities in our lives, relationships, in our joys and struggles. And my hope is that this material will help you expand your perspective, give you some clarity on how to think about things, and ultimately make you feel better and sorted about your life and relationships. Hope you have a fulfilling and wholesome day.